Loki against the Aesir. The Aesir were the guests of the Vanir. In Frey's palace the dwellers in Asgard met and feasted in friendship. Odin and Tyr were there, Vidar and Vali, Njord, Frey, Heimdall, and Bragi. The Aesir and the Vanna were also there. Frigga, Freya, Iduna, Gerda, Skadi, Sif, and Nanna. Thor and Loki were not at the feast, for they had left Asgard together. In Frey's palace the vessels were of shining gold. They made light for the table, and they moved of their own accord to serve those who were feasting. All was peace and friendship there, until Loki entered the feast hall. Frey, smiling a welcome, showed a bench to Loki. It was beside Bragi's and next to Freya's. Loki did not take the place. Instead, he shouted out, "Not beside Bragi will I sit. Not beside Bragi, the most craven of all the dwellers in Asgard." Bragi sprang up at that affront, but his wife, the mild Iduna, quieted his anger. Freya turned to Loki and reproved him for speaking injurious words at a feast. "Freya," said Loki, "why were you not so mild when Odin was with you? Would it not have been well to have been wifely with your husband, instead of breaking faith with him for the sake of a necklace that you craved of the giant women?" Amazement fell on all at the bitterness that was in Loki's words and looks. Tyr and Njord stood up from their seats. But then the voice of Odin was heard, and all was still for the words of the Allfather. "Take the place beside Vidar, my silent son, O Loki, and let thy tongue which drips bitterness be silent." All the Aesir and the Vanir listened to thy words, O Odin, as if it were always wise and just, Loki said. "But must we forget that thou didst bring war into the world when thou didst fling thy spear at the envoys of the Vanir? And didst thou not permit me to work craftily on the one who built the wall around Asgard for a price? Thou dost speak, O Odin, and all the Aesir and the Vanir listened to thee. But it was not thou who, thinking not of wisdom but of gold, when a ransom had to be made, brought the witch Golvig out of the cave where she stayed with the dwarf's treasure. Thou wert not always wise, nor always just, O Odin, and we at the table here need not listen to thee as if thou always wert." Then Skadi, the wife of Njord, flung words at Loki. She spoke with all the fierceness of her giant blood. "Why should we not rise up and chase from the hall this chattering crow?" she said. "Skadi," said Loki, "remember that the ransom for thy father's death has not yet been paid. Thou wert glad to snatch a husband instead of it. Remember who it was who killed thy father. It was I, Loki, and no ransom have I paid for it, although thou hast come among us in Asgard." Then Loki fixed his eyes on Frey, the giver of the feast, and all knew that with bitter words he was about to assail him. But Tyr, the brave swordsman, rose up and said, "Not against Frey mayest thou speak, O Loki. Frey is generous. He is the one amongst us who spares the vanquished and frees the captive." "Cease speaking, Tyr," said Loki. "Thou mayest not always have a hand to hold that sword of thine. Remember this saying of mine in days to come." "And Frey," he said, "because thou art giver of the feast, they think I will not speak the truth about thee. But I am not to be bribed by a feast. Didst thou not send Skirnir to Gymer's dwelling to befool Gymer's flighty daughter? Didst thou not bribe him into frightening her into a marriage with thee, who, men say, wert the slayer of her own brother? Yea, Frey, thou didst part with the charge, in the magic sword that thou shouldst have kept for the battle. Thou hadst cause to grieve when thou didst meet Beli by the lake. When he said this, all who were there of the Vanir rose up, their faces threatening Loki. Sit still, ye Vanir, Loki railed. If the Aesir are to bear the brunt of Jotunheim and Muspelheim's war upon Asgard, it was your part to be the first or the last in Vigard's plain. But already ye have lost the battle for Asgard. For the weapon that was put into Frey's hand he bartered for Gerda the giantess. Ha! Surtur shall triumph over you because of Frey's bewitchment. In horror they looked at the one who could let his hatred speak of Surtur's triumph. All would have laid hands on Loki, only Odin's voice rang out. Then another appeared at the entrance of the feasting hall. It was Thor. With his hammer upon his shoulder, and his gloves of iron upon his hands, and his belt of prowess around him, he stood marking Loki with wrathful eyes. Loki, betrayer, he shouted, thou didst plan to leave me dead in Geirrod's house, but now thou wilt meet death by the stroke of this hammer. His hands were raised to hurl Mjolnir, but the words that Odin spoke were heard. Not in this hall may slaying be done, son Thor. Keep thy hands upon thy hammer. Then, shrinking from the wrath in the eyes of Thor, Loki passed out of the feast hall. He went beyond the walls of Asgard and crossed Bifrost, the rainbow bridge. And he cursed Bifrost, and longed to see the day when the armies of Muspelheim would break it down in their rush against Asgard. East of Midgard there was a place more evil than any region in Jotunheim. It was Jonvid, the Iron Wood. There dwelt witches who were the most foul of all witches. And they had a queen over them, a hag, a mother of many sons who took upon themselves the shapes of wolves. Two of her sons were Skoll and Hati, who pursued Mol the sun and Mani the moon. She had a third son who was Managarm, the wolf who was to be filled with the lifeblood of men, who was to swallow up the moon and stain the heavens and earth with blood. To Jonvid, the Iron Wood, Loki made his way, and he wed one of the witches there, Angerboda, and they had children that were horrible to look upon. Loki's offspring were the most terrible of all the foes that were to come against the Aesir and the Vanir in the time that was called the Twilight of the Gods.